good morning, everyone, or good afternoon officially. So welcome to the Kerwin Institute Forum Series. We are super excited that you're joining us here today, whether you are in the room or whether you are joining us online. We thank you for taking out a little bit of your day to spend with us and learn about the LA Governance Reform Project. So my name is Dr. Jordan Linson-Cox, and I am the Associate Director of Research here at the Kerwin Institute. It is my pleasure to introduce you to Drs. Hancock, Segura, and Sonenshein, who will be speaking about their work on the LA Governance Reform Project. So, Sonenshein, I apologize. So, as some background, the Los Angeles Governance Reform Project brought together university scholars, researchers, and leaders from across the region to develop independent, nonpartisan governance reform proposals that would advance a more transparent, accountable, and community-driven City of Los Angeles municipal government, as well as inform broader civic and community engagement. In 2023, they were able to develop an interim report, which included a draft recommendation that was made public in June 2023, and a final report that was released in December 2023. Today, we have with us three critical leaders of the LA Governance Reform Project, co-chairs Dr. Anne-Marie Hancock and Dr. Gary Segura, as well as Raphael Sonenshein. I would like to take a moment to share a little bit of background about our speakers today. So many of you already know Dr. Anne-Marie Hancock. She's the Executive Director here at the Kerwin Institute, as well as the ENGIE Axiom Endowed Professor of Political Science. She's globally recognized as a scholar of intersectional theory and has written numerous articles and 3 books on the intersections of categories of difference like race, gender, class, sexuality, and citizenship, and their impact on policy. Her books include the award-winning Politics of Disgust and the Public Identity of the Welfare Queen, Solidarity Politics for Millennials, and she's currently working on the scope and vision of African-American political thought, which is going to cover about 250 years of African-American political thought. So Dr. Hancock has led several applied and community-engaged research projects, which is why she is kind of our leader here at Kerwin. These projects include the Racial Equity Baseline Study for the City of Los Angeles and her role in co-chairing the LA Governance Reform Project. She also was a part of the providing empirically rigorous data analyses for the Black Experience Action Team and the USC Department of Public Safety Community Advisory Board. Dr. Raphael Sonenshein is the Executive Director of the John Randolph Haynes and Dora Haynes Foundation. Previously, he served as the Executive Director of the Pat Brown Institute for Public Arts and Humanities. Public Affairs at Cal State LA. He's nationally recognized expert on racial and ethnic politics on California and Los Angeles. His books reflect this expertise, which include Politics in Black and White, Race and Power in Los Angeles, The City at Stake, Secession, Reform, and the Battle for Los Angeles, and Los Angeles, the Structure of a City Government. He formerly served as the Executive Director of the Los Angeles Charter Reform Commission, a role that was appointed, and that position led to the city's first comprehensive charter reform in 75 years. He has since guided successful charter reform commissions in half a dozen cities. And finally, we have Dr. Gary Segura, who's a professor of public policy, political science, and Chicana studies at UCLA. He's the former dean of the Luskin School of Public Affairs at UCLA, and his work focuses on issues of political representation and social cleavages, the domestic policies of wartime public opinion, and the politics of America's growing Latino minority. He is the author of several articles and 2 books with the Latino National Survey Team, including Latinos in the New Millennium and Latino Lives in America. He has another book in press, Calculated War, the Public and a Theory of Conflict, that he's working on with Scott S. Gardner. And he was the co-chair for the LA Governance Reform Project. So as you can see from these extremely auspicious biographies, we are very lucky to have these hosts to guide this conversation as a part of our Kerwin Forum series. As just a little bit of housekeeping, we have attendees in person, and then we also have quite a few folks online. And so because of this, we ask you to hold all of your questions until the end of the presentation, after which we will have a formal Q&A. For those of you online, at that time, you will post your questions in the chat, and Glennon, who is kind of operating the chat at this time, will ask your questions on your behalf. So on that note, I'll turn it over to our speakers. Thank you, and I look forward to this conversation.
Thank you very much, Jordan. Greetings, Raphe. Greetings, Gary. It is good to see you all online. We are excited to be here and to talk a little bit about basically the title of this conversation, which is Academics in Search of Good Governance. So I want to kick it off. Raphe and Gary, I'm going to ask each of you just to talk a little bit about what happened in Los Angeles back in October of 2022 that kind of precipitated our need to work together for the past 12 to 14 months on this project. So Gary, why don't you go first, and then Raphe, and then we'll flip it for the next one.
Great, I get to describe this disaster. First of all, my apologies to everyone. I'm on my cell phone because of an internet service provider outage, so I hope I don't fall off the call. So as all jurisdictions have to, after the 2020 census, Los Angeles had to redraw its city council district lines. That process used an appointed commission where each elected official in Los Angeles plays a role in selecting the commissioners. The report of the commission was ultimately rejected by the city council, and a new set of lines drawn by them and ultimately adopted. Unbeknownst to the participants, 3 members of the city council were recorded in conversation during that process. And in October of 2022, the recording became public. The recording, for lack of a better way of describing it, sounds something like a Trump rally, but with a Chicano accent. It was terrible. It was filled with zero-sum politics, use of more than one racial epithet, anti-gay language, language that was demeaning to indigenous persons, even indigenous persons of Latino identity. It was over the top in really profound ways. It involved 3 members of the city council, including the council president. The council president resigned. One of the 2 participants in the conversation was already on his way off the council, having been defeated in the primary. And the 3rd council member has resisted calls to resign, including very serious confrontational meetings, and is currently on the ballot in November to be one of the 2 finalists in his council district. Whether he survives this or not is unclear. In some instances, these comments really reflected an underlying truth and also an underlying ugliness. The underlying truth is that Latinos are underrepresented in the Los Angeles City Council, as it was before and as it was redrawn. And Latinos are underrepresented on the LA County Board of Supervisors. Latinos represent about 50% of the population of the city of Los Angeles, roughly 2 million of the 4 million people here, and about 50% of the county, roughly 5.5 million of the 11 million people here. And yet they don't have anything approximating proportional representation.
Thank you. And Raphe, do you want to pick up kind of where Gary left off and talk about kind of how we came together? But also, I think it's important to note that this was a Democratic supermajority city, a Democratic supermajority kind of context. So we need to talk also about the partisanship elements of how this gets to happen.
Thanks, Sandra Marie, and good to see you, Gary. Essentially, Los Angeles politics is still, for better or worse, coalition politics because of weak party organizations, historically, going back forever, but particularly as it's become much more democratic than it was 20, 25 years ago when the voters there were maybe a third of the electorate Republican, and now it's in the teens. And the transactions between and among communities are critically important. And right now, I'd say the most important relationship is between Latinos and African Americans. And as Gary pointed out, there's a dynamic of rising and falling likely representation and hoping to find a soft landing going forward. And that work was completely interrupted by these vile comments, which, by the way, were rejected by the great mass of Latino elected officials almost immediately, including close allies of some of the people on that call. But it left a bitter taste. But Los Angeles is also a reform city. It has a great tradition of political and governance reform. And what sometimes happens is LA's solution to a crisis in a community can be trying to fix the system. And in this case, since redistricting was already a sore point, even before the release of the recordings, there was a real push to try to fix the redistricting process so two things would never happen again. The second one may be harder than the first. One is that the city council can't corrupt the process that was meant to be done led by an appointed commission. And secondly, that redistricting itself wouldn't make things worse between racial and ethnic communities. It may never make things better, but certainly it should not, if possible, make things worse. So the city council, which is the most powerful city council in the United States, bar none, took it upon itself to begin thinking about how to do these reforms. But there was kind of a feeling because of this, and something to add to what Gary said, a series of indictments, resignations, vacancies on the city council that were calling the kind of ethical basis of the city council's leadership into question. So philanthropy came to academia. And you have to understand that in LA, its leadership is where you find it. It's not a formal system of one person leading. And the foundations you see here, and especially a few leaders in that foundation world, one of whom is a very experienced governmental leader named Miguel Santana, reached out to us in the academic community to say, could there be an independent view of this that can be brought to the city council, which has the power to put reform measures on the ballot? And we came together as a group and thought it was best to have a diverse range of universities, a diverse range of people. So both to represent the largest and most famous universities, USC and UCLA, but also the Cal States, private universities, small and large, in Los Angeles, which also has a very diverse academic community. What's remarkable about our group is we just started meeting. Nobody gave us a marching orders, including philanthropy. They just said, go forth and prosper. So we went forth and prospered. The 6 people here were the 6 people who started this and are the 6 people at the end of the process. No one left and no one else. This was the group. But we added a group of researchers because one of the things that's most important is not to just be a bunch of academics popping off with our opinions, but to make sure that all of this was based on research, which in my view was a signal contribution, was both the independence of the academics, but the academics remaining academics, which we'll talk about through today, rather than just being political players on our own who happen to be at universities. And we'll talk a lot about that dynamic as we go, but we met and we worked together and we deliberated and we had a wonderful time. We enjoyed each other's company. We disagreed without being disagreeable. We got outvoted, each of us, on things that were our pet ideas. We changed our minds on particular things. And it was a wonderful year of working together.
Yeah, I want to co-sign on that. We literally, when we say we worked together over the course of a year, we literally met every other week for 2 hours at each of those meetings, right? And so when we were reviewing things, we were reviewing 18 different informational briefs that, again, the research team here, led by Francisco Jasso and led by Timothy Krebs, were able to pull together for us. So every time there was a particular question, we went down the rabbit hole and chased down the answers. And again, I think, Raphe, I want to ask you, I'm going to talk about it a little bit, but I also want to ask you why it was so important that two of the things you mentioned happened. One, that we were research-based. This was not just us, in our political opinions. And also, we're all political scientists for the most part. There were a few folks who weren't maybe connected as closely to political science. But, again, we have very clear understandings of the literature and then very clear opinions, but we were willing to be convinced. So what was the role of research? And then, I think it's also important for us to talk about the role of independence. That again, even though we had some funding from philanthropy, we had conversations with civic groups, we had conversations with elected officials, we were really wedded to the idea of we are independent and you can't kind of, nudge us, sway us, organize us. We're going to follow the facts. So you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, it was a funny thing because when I joined the group, one of the things I advised everybody, and one of the many things I was wrong about, was that we shouldn't call ourselves academics because everybody thinks that means you're pie in the sky. And as it turns out, they just called us academics no matter what we did. And they actually meant it as a compliment, which came to me as an astonishing revelation. I thought we should call ourselves professors or something. But it turns out that even though people make fun of the academic community all the time, especially in government, where they all say, well, they don't get it, they don't know, they're pointy-headed intellectuals, there's a great respect for the university community and the work that we do, as long as we don't try to be something we're not, which is just another city council, another bunch of political players. We kept saying, let's be ourselves. And it turned out that it provided credibility without our asking for credibility. We didn't go out and have a strategy for credibility. Reporters would call us, newspaper articles would report on our work, and we hadn't even really pursued it very hard. But they would say, here's what the academics said. And Gary will point out later that in one of the focus groups that we conducted, somebody threw their hands up and just said, why don't we just let the academics figure this out? Which was probably more than we could bite off. But it was a reminder that independence doesn't mean setting up an alternate power structure. It means it creates an alternate role, which we should not shy away from. But in truth, we are also careful not to run off by ourselves as if the real world didn't exist and propose things that were madness because they were cool in academia. And, ideas have to percolate a while in academia before they're ready for prime time. So we kept our eyes open. We talked to the city staffs, and the city does research as well, but it's not as independent as we were, but we paid respectful attention to what they were doing. But we never, I don't know, I would say, Gary and Ange-Marie, we never really moved off our kind of identity, which became a kind of a brand without our doing any branding, just doing our work and saying it's based on research because, in fact, it was. And none of us had preconceived ideas about what our conclusion should be.
Yeah, no, I totally understand and take your point. And Gary, I know you're back with us. I want to see if we can bring you into the conversation to really talk about this idea of the independence part of the brand, and where, again, there were sometimes pressures and challenges, but we really tried to really stick to this idea of, yes, it's research driven, but it's also independent, right? And we're not going to be kind of swayed, and why that was important as well.
Yes, and once again, my apologies to everyone. The independence was critical, as Raphe indicated, and Ange-Marie, you've mentioned, the degree to which we did not get out over our skis, but in fact stayed within the boundaries of data and the received wisdom of the literature and what the science has to say about municipal governance, really served as an insulation for us. We cannot be accused of carrying a torch for any position or for any actor in the system. And we were very careful about that. And that meant some awkward conversations. There was an attempt for us to coordinate very closely with the advocacy organizations, and we did confer with them, but we made it clear that's not our role. We're not electioneers. We're not an interest group who's going to pressure people. Our job is to just tell you what the received wisdom is.
Yeah, and I think, even internally, there are folks in the group itself who, again, in their other lives, wearing other hats, might have those kinds of commitments. So the idea wasn't that, we weren't that ever, but for the purposes of this project, it is indeed possible and important that those hats kind of sit outside of the process, and that can be just as legitimate and also just as much of a contribution. I also want to have a conversation where we talk a little bit about the research that we did. So I'm going to talk about it a little bit, but also Gary, want you to talk a little bit about this, because we kind of split our management duties, if you will, with regard to these two different kinds. So in addition to just reviewing what the literature and the research has been saying over the past couple of decades, we also conducted our own research, right, where we actually talked to Angelenos about what they want. And so again, while elected officials and advocacy groups were interested in our data, we wanted to make sure that the execution of this research was top notch. So we did run some qualitative focus groups. And again, because we're social scientists, we developed the tools and everything, but we also did contract with independent organizations, again, to actually conduct the research on our behalf. So for the focus groups, we partnered with Ebony Marketing Systems to conduct 12 focus groups that were grouped by race and ethnicity, as well as gender and sexual expression. So in other words, we had paired groups. So we did African-American men, African-American women, again, self-identified. We did that for Latinos. We did that for Asian American API community. We also did that for the Native American community, the white community. And then we did do a non-binary focus group as well. Again, self-identified, self-selected, so that we were really trying to encompass the full breadth of the folks who live in Los Angeles. The folks came from all corners of Los Angeles, so we were able to get respondents from all 15 council districts. And we had a good breakdown of folks who were longtime residents, 56%, and then folks who might have been newer arrivals, 44%. So we also weren't getting just the folks who are kind of been here forever and know how, LA works, but nor did we get just the newcomers who kind of maybe have different ideas, but don't know the history of Los Angeles, don't know what's gone on in the past, and don't have an appreciation for it. Gary, do you want to talk a little bit about the polling? So I kind of helped with the qualitative side, and then Gary helped with the polling side of things.
Sure, thanks, Marie. We contracted with Interviewing Services of America and did a probability poll of the entire registered voter electorate in Los Angeles City, 1,624 respondents. We set minimum quotas by racial and ethnic group to make sure we had analyzable subsamples of each group, but the overall totals were then, we subjected them to post-stratification weighting so that the citywide estimates are in fact representative. And we asked them direct questions about the subjects we were interested in. So the poll is very representative of the electorate. And we thought it was important because both advocacy organizations and elected officials are fond of saying, well, the public believes, and they're just pulling it out of their head. And we wanted to actually know what the public believed.
Yeah, I think that was both of those were really important components. And again, that was also where we got to fact check, because in the process, we did the preliminary kind of recommendations we released in June were based on the research, based on our conversations with experts, but then we got to fact check ourselves with the kind of focus groups and the polling, right? So again, this idea of being, an iterative process was really important. Gary, do you want to just pivot to talk a little bit about the broad support for an independent redistricting commission that we found?
Sure. So overwhelmingly, the electorate was in favor of an independent redistricting commission, both for the LA Unified School District and for the city council, 75, 76% in each case. And, we made it very clear, we tried to use very neutral language, but should districts be drawn by the people who would ultimately run in them, or should districts be drawn by a neutral party, overwhelmingly a neutral party? And then we asked the specific question, would you vote for the creation of an independent redistricting commission? And again, across race and ethnicity, with remarkably little variation, we got huge levels of support for IRCs in both bodies. And we actually went back and checked the numbers because Ange-Marie and Raphe and I, as well as our other commissioners on our panel, we kept going back to look to see, well, this is unusually stable to not see a wide variety, particularly between white voters and non-white voters, but across the board, Angelenos are ready to see this cleaned up.
Yeah, I did think that was interesting too. And we did go back and check those numbers a couple of times to make sure we were seeing what we were seeing. The other thing that I found was really interesting about these findings is that this is a year past the public, kind of revelation of the scandal, right? So the durability of this opinion, obviously we did not poll in 2022, so I can't say for sure, but we don't think it was just kind of, people remember from a year ago, I mean, how many of us remember what we had for lunch, much less remember, the scandal of a year ago, in this day and age with so many things going on. So we really do trust what we found in terms of the polling. And then again, also the focus groups, were similarly supportive of an independent approach. So we did come up with some recommendations, and as Gary talked about, the kind of 2 independent commissions. Raphe, I want to pivot to you and talk a little bit about ethics reform, because that was not necessarily one of our original topics. We had kind of said, maybe we could talk about ethics, if it comes up, or if we have time, or if we have bandwidth. But it became much more important. So Raphe, do you want to talk about kind of our evolution on kind of really thinking that ethics reform is part of this package in an important way?
Yeah, and we had 3 big issues, which was redistricting reform, increasing the size of the city council, and ethics reform. And ethics reform came along a little later, but it was one of those things that once we started talking about it, we all had this aha feeling of reminding us why we were here in the first place. And remember, it wasn't just the problem of the redistricting process, it was the ethics issues at City Hall, which had become and are continuing. In reading the papers the last few days, there's still criminal investigations and ethics commission investigations. So we dug into it, and we did. I think our group was instrumental in making it assumed that should be part of reform, although it has not yet actually taken place. But we put it on the agenda, and as political scientists, we can tell you when you put something on the agenda, that's the first step toward eventually getting it done. We argued that there needs to be, just as redistricting needs to be independent, that the ethics process needs to have more independence from the city council. LA has a very strong ethics commission relative to other cities in the country, but in our view, it's not strong enough, given the importance of the LA City Council and the challenge of holding people accountable on ethics issues. So we called people around the country, and especially cities that had gone a little farther, like San Francisco, and found that they allowed their ethics commission with a supermajority vote to put measures on the ballot directly. Just so you know, reform efforts require the city council to put something on the ballot. So the ethics commission has to go hat in hand to the city council to ask for more regulatory power over the city council, or to give the voters a chance to weigh in on that. We don't think that should be that. We don't think the city council should have the last say on the rules that govern their own ethics. So it's kind of on hold now at City Hall, because redistricting is going forward, but increasing council size and ethics reform, increasing council size is on hold completely, and ethics reform so far seems to be limited to budgetary reforms. But we're still sticking our heads in on this one. I don't think, Gary, you'd think that the voting returns on ethics reform are going to be any less positive than the ones on independent redistricting. So that's still an open question, and I don't think we're out of that ball game yet.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree, and I think one of the things that you just said is the precise explanation for why it should not just be in the city council's hands. The city council has decided this is not going to be a priority, right? And so again, every time the ethics commission has to go hat in hand to the city council saying, we'd like to regulate you more tightly, you know, again, I mean, it's a little bit like asking a 9-year-old who's had too much sugar if they're tired and they need to go to bed. You know, they're going to essentially not agree with what needs to happen, but everybody knows that it needs to happen, right? The other thing I thought that was really interesting here is, as you both know, Ohio is in the middle of a discussion about redistricting at the statewide level. And of course, California has had a statewide independent redistricting commission for now 2 cycles. One of our leadership team members, Sarah Sedwani, sat on that commission, was very helpful in kind of how we were talking about it at a local level. But we've also had some pretty huge corruption here, right? Like the former speaker of the House at the state level just got 20 years in prison for taking bribes, right? So when we think about this idea of ethics reform and how it needs to accompany independent redistricting, again, I think of LA, 4 million people, Ohio, about 8 million people. You know, we need to think about if it's necessary at a 4 million person level, there's probably a good chance that it's going to be more, if not, you know, absolutely necessary at a broader level as well. So we did see that ethics was widely supported, as we just talked about. And the idea, again, that we wanted to have that update was really important to make sure that, again, the Ethics Commission has greater, not just independence, because I think that's something important that Raphe talked about, but also that there was enough size, scale, and budget. And again, this is where we get into the weeds as political scientists of thinking about, you know, we don't want to have unfunded mandates where we're telling the same 5 members of the Ethics Commission that they need to do now 20 to 40% more work than they were actually doing prior to that. And oh yeah, there's no money or budget to do that. So the other recommendations we came up with was to expand the size of the Ethics Commission from 5 to 7. And again, in the balance of powers kind of way, saying that the appointments would actually come from the executive branch and the legislative branch respectively. And then the budget protection, that again, the budget should be protected from the council coming in and cutting it, again, as a way to wield power over the Ethics Commission. So it ended up being a very robust section of our work, even though we weren't necessarily kind of anticipating how robust it would end up being. And I think to Rafe's point, you know, we are absolutely, just because the city council has shelved it, you know, again, asking a 9-year-old if they've had too much sugar and they need to go to bed, you know, maybe there needs to be, you know, again, we're sticking to our guns, that maybe that really does need to be put to bed. So in any case, Gary, I'm just going to check in with you, see if there was anything that we've missed before we open it up for questions. And then Raphe, I'm going to double back to you for the same thing.
Okay. I'm sorry, I was offline for a bit. Did we talk at all about council size?
We did not. We were going to leave that for the Q&A, but
Okay.
Were there other things that you wanted to mention before we turn it over to Q&A?
Yeah, just a couple things. The first is that when Raphe said that there was enthusiastic embrace for the discussion of ethics reform, that came from every corner of the city, save one, which was the LA City Council. And I think, you know, I'm a bit of the cynic among the 3 of us, and I want the audience to understand exactly the dimensions of what we're talking about. The LA City Council has 15 members. 8 of them, 8 different members of the city council have either been publicly discredited, investigated, indicted, or convicted in the last 5 years. That's 8 out of 15. So no, not all at the same time, and let's be fair, but the culture of the Los Angeles political culture is very, very stable and very, very transactional. And the need for ethics reform just screams from any impartial observer looking at this would smack themselves in the forehead and say, I can't believe this is allowed to happen. So this really is an enduring issue for the city.
Yeah, and I want to connect the point that you just made, Gary. Raphe, and another project that you worked on the city's approach to homelessness.
Mhm.
And so I think one of the other aspects, right, around citing affordable housing, right, that whole process is very transactional. So could we use like what you found in that work as kind of evidence of what Gary was talking about this transactional nature that in fact might perpetuate some of the problems that Los Angeles faces with things like homelessness?
Well, we have a kind of structural challenge that East Coast cities and Midwest cities don't have. It creates a lot of creativity, but also a lot of problems, which is multiple jurisdictions that can't say no to each other. It's a horizontal, not a vertically organized governance structure. And homelessness, that meant the county does social services and the city does housing. And then it takes someone like Karen Bass, who can work with everybody to pull everybody into a room and say, let's link arms, but there's no structural arm linking. And on the city council side, because of the power of the council, individual council members have great authority over what happens in their district, including on homelessness policy about what will happen with encampments, which is one of the hottest issues in LA, where council members can have an individual say on that, which makes it hard to create policy. So all these things kind of intersect. And let me point out something about the limits of reform. We can't solve both problems in redistricting. We could solve one. One was the council's ability to redo an independent process and not do it. It still remains to be seen as even with an independent redistricting process, will the conflict between racial and ethnic communities not emerge even with an independent commission? Fortunately, the county has shown us, since the County of LA had an independent commission that was very quiet, but nothing in LA City is ever really quiet. And the last point before, moving to questions, is remember what we're talking about with the council is not their voting against a reform. It's whether to exercise their power to give the voters the opportunity to weigh in on a reform. Because everything we did in our work was about reforming the city charter. And should the city council be the sole route by which the voters get to choose things? And we broke through that as a community on redistricting now, which is very exciting. The council is putting it on the ballot. But it's been a much bigger haul to get increasing council size and full-scale ethics reform for the voters to consider. The council's not voting them down. They're not putting them on the ballot. And so that's part of the structural issue about reform, which I, by the way, as a charter person, I'm giving more thought to, since the city council is now talking about creating a charter reform commission for unresolved issues. How do you not repeat the same thing that happened with redistricting, where it's an advisory commission whose recommendations don't make it to the ballot? So just so you know, that's the structural reform question.
And I think that I just want to follow up with a quick question to you, Raphe. You had said that the Los Angeles City Council is uniquely powerful in terms of, compared to other city councils across the country. Would you characterize this piece, this power of being able to, again, place something on the ballot or essentially pocket veto something by not putting it on the ballot? Is that one of the things that makes them uniquely powerful, or is that a common thing that most city councils have across the country?
That is the most common thing anywhere in the country. And every city I've worked with, the city council ultimately decides whether something gets on the ballot, unless the voters have the ability to get signatures to put it on the ballot directly by initiative. The Ethics Commission we have was started in 1991 because enough civic groups could threaten effectively to get a measure on the ballot that the city council negotiated with them to put something on the ballot that became the LA City Ethics Commission. But no, it is extremely normal but the difference is when the council's this strong, the stakes of reform are escalated dramatically for the governance of the city. So it really matters what they put on the ballot. Probably more than you might see in a smaller city.
Really important. And again, if you think about the state level, what's going on in Ohio versus what went on in California, both of them have that ability at the state level to be able to collect signatures so that citizens can get something on a ballot. So it's something that's going on here in Ohio, and that's something that did happen in California for pushing to get an independent redistricting commission. Questions. Do we have questions? Looks like
That's me telling.
oh, that's you telling everyone to put some questions in.
But I have.
Go ahead, Glennon.
So I'm curious on your thoughts on Columbus. So Columbus is a city of between 900,000 and a million. And Columbus recently created a ward system, which I refer to as fake wards, because these wards are geographically representative of the city, but they are all elected at large. And I would love to get your thoughts on that. And the background behind this is that there were numerous citizen initiatives to try and get wards. And when essentially it looked like this was going to happen, city council created their own thing. And so I'm very curious in your thoughts.
I'm going to kick that to Raphe because Raphe and I have actually talked about this a little bit in terms of this system. So Raphe, do you want to weigh in on that question?
I have a feeling Gary and I are going to agree because he's shaking his head. This is, by the way, I did some work in Tucson on charter reform, and this was the system they had for a long time, which is you'd have to be a resident of a ward or district, but run citywide, which, if that's what I'm hearing, it a little bit defeats the purpose of the ward system, which is meant to be something where if the city's large enough, the interests are diverse enough that it's important to have district representation. Now, as Gary knows from his experience in voting rights work in California, the push against at-large elections for medium and larger sized cities to create districts is pretty strong. So Gary, is that your view? Because you were shaking your head and I figured that's what you were going to say.
You and I agree 100%. At-large votes for phony districts is the worst form of representation.
Yeah.
Because the vote dilution that comes with at-large voting can continue to exist, but then we can throw up the Potemkin village of having created representation for different interests when in fact it's the same electorate. So in a Los Angeles sense, if Bel Air and Brentwood voters are determining who represents East LA on the city council, East LA is not represented. Brentwood and Bel Air are represented by a brown person. That's shameful. So I think that's the worst system possible.
Gary, could you also just elaborate a little bit on the ways in which this works from a voting rights perspective in terms of how you might look at whether or not there is this vote dilution that might be, well, I don't know if it would be in violation of the gutted Voting Rights Act at the federal level, but what we take to be the spirit of the Voting Rights Act.
Sure. So prior to Shelby County, the standard was that an at-large system would be considered vote dilutive if it prevented significant populations of a group from having any opportunity to elect a first choice candidate. And there was a standard that was applied called the Gingle Standard. And if the group was numerous enough to form more than 50% of a single member district or geographically concentrated, they could sue under Section 2 to have some form of representation. Of course, all that's been made more difficult in the absence of Shelby County and in the current environment where the courts are so hostile to the Voting Rights Act. But think about this. If it turns out that the voters of East LA are represented by a candidate that they didn't select, but was selected citywide, apply that same logic to the city of Columbus, then they're not getting the opportunity to elect their first choice candidate. And the way you would determine that is you look at how the votes break down across candidates by precinct in the city. So in one of your new fake wards, if the majority of the votes in the fake wards went for candidate A, but candidate B ends up winning because of votes in other parts of the city, that would be evidence that that district was denied the opportunity to vote for the candidate of their choice.
Thank you for that example. And so again, when you think about patterns of residential segregation, which is why we want to think about whether or not these wards could work or should work. And again, this is not a partisan argument in the sense of whether it's Democrats doing this, whether it's Republicans doing this. This is problematic from a representational perspective, right? So other questions in the audience? Go ahead, Jordan.
Yeah, I had a question about representation kind of on a more structural level. So I think there's an idea, if you have a democratic government with diversity on it, that therefore it will always serve a diverse population's needs. But we know that actually the ways in which race and class operate when paired together means that sometimes they don't, right? And sometimes we can have people who are like skin folk but not kin folk. And so I think part of the kind of story of where this conflict starts from kind of is evocative of that. And so I would love for you guys to talk about kind of the politics of representation at the government and city council level.
Sure. So happy to have the two of you start, again, just the tension between elite representation versus representation that would be kind of more substantive in nature and the way in which, I should say, elites do or do not represent what the masses might actually want. So Gary, can I start with you on that one? Because I know in your work on Latino politics, this is a big question.
Sure, and so the questioner asked a great question because co-ethnic representation is neither necessary nor sufficient for getting genuine representation of a community. Just having a Black representative of a Black community, a Latino representative of a Latino community does not by itself guarantee that you're going to get representation, and having a white person in that seat doesn't rule it out. It is, however, how the smart money bets. And so to the extent that a Black representative is the first choice candidate of Black voters, or a Latino representative is the first choice candidate of Latino voters, that is more likely to be representative than a system in which that's not the case. But the dynamic of representation is ongoing, and faithless representatives to Americans of all racial and ethnic identities or ideological dispositions, faithless representatives are a common problem in democracy.
Thank you. And Raphe, sorry. I wanted to pivot to you because you've done so much work on coalition politics. You talked a little bit about how it works in Los Angeles, but can you talk a little bit about some of these, now necessary coalition politics that have to, again, not just look at the descriptive representation that's going on, what they look like and what group they might come from, but that there needs to be more substantive representation in a coalitional context. So whether that's Karen Bass or somebody else.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a reminder that groups are not monolithic. And one of the things about that devastating recording is it also reflected factional politics in the Latino community. It was not the whole Latino community, but it was a faction holding its power on the city council. And very often the relationships between communities aren't like a playing card called African Americans or Jews or Asian Americans or Latinos. It's a set of people inside that community who make a case to kind of represent that community in the wider community. So I'm actually very hopeful about Black Latino relations as long as this technical representational issue, which is really a trap, which is how many seats there are on the city council for each community, ultimately becomes kind of a dead end. Because what Gary's talking about is substantive representation, which is not just a numbers game. Honestly, since I've been studying this back from before there were any folks on city councils from communities of color, the first group that came in as part of a mass mobilization in minority communities without any question. But the next generations through, it gets more complicated. So if you look at the east side of LA right now, there's a more left-wing, more progressive bloc in the Latino east side that is beginning to supplant the traditional Latino elected officials. And Kevin De Leon is one of the last ones kind of hanging on. And that was accelerated by the release of the recording. But the folks coming into the city council are not from the traditional Latino political community. It's a new political community, which is Latino led, but is also multi-ethnic and progressive. So we're getting into a more complicated thing, but I think your question is very well taken. It's not just a numbers game. It's not just the numbers of people who check a box, but I think Gary's point also is the odds are pretty good that representation will be strengthened by a well-grounded, rooted person from the community. But the Voting Rights Act doesn't guarantee who sits in that seat. It guarantees the ability of the community to elect who will sit in that seat.
Yeah, and I'll just add the part that does tie back to redistricting, right? When you have gerrymandered districts, when you don't have fairly drawn or equitably drawn districts, you actually end up increasing the amount of political polarization that a particular elected official can take, right? So in other words, if they know they are in a safe district and they can pretty much do anything that they want, right? They will then be encouraged to much more extreme position and to not negotiate and to not compromise. So when you look at why things are going wrong in Congress or why things are going wrong in various legislatures, a lot of that polarization, if there are a lot of gerrymandered districts, again, the idea would be the gerrymandered districts are part of what's driving that polarization. People don't have to be reasonable. People don't have to think about how do I talk to the other side if they know they're going to win every single election, right? And that's something that, again, we're talking about here in Ohio at the state level. We're talking about it in a variety of different places. New York, state level, same thing, Democratic-led state. Ohio, same thing, Republican-led state. So just again, reinforcing the idea that this is not, only Democrats do this or only Republicans do this. This is about power. And power corrupts, right? And people want to stay in office and they're willing to do what it takes to make themselves or their party stay in office. I wouldn't even say this is a US thing. I would say that, if you look at other places, the idea of wanting to stay in power is not unique to the United States. Other questions? Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm curious if any of the three of you have any advice for us here in Columbus who want fair representation, fair local districts or wards. How do we go about doing that? I mean, I'd love to have it informed by academics, but I mean, right now, Columbus made these boards, city council did. They have no interest in this. So what advice would you give us?
Gary and Raphe, you guys do more consulting than I do, so I'm going to turn it over to you all.
Gary, are you there?
Wow. I am here. I'm something of a cynic. That there are moments. There are moments where the right combination of activism, academic support, and grassroots mobilization produce change. And we've seen those moments take place. So I definitely would never counsel cynicism or despair. That said, it is a building process. You would have to get the right coalition of folks, the right attorneys. If I don't know, I know the citizen initiative is possible statewide in Ohio. I don't know if it's possible in the city of Columbus in the charter. Ange-Marie, do you know could you signature collect to do that?
Yeah, not sure. At the city level, I don't know. Yeah.
I do know that as a general proposition, relying on elected officials to limit the power of elected officials is not a winning strategy. You have to go around them.
There is some experience here. You take Orange County, right next to LA County, had at-large elections for the city council, and everybody on the city council practically lived in Anaheim Hills, which was the most affluent part of that city. They eventually, under pressure from lawsuits, which in California you can do because of the California Voting Rights Act, adapted and now have a system that is much more representative. But let me tell you what will happen if you build the coalition Gary's talking about. You need to address an argument, which I think is a wrong argument, but it's a persuasive argument, which is that if you go to district elections, I can actually write for you what the no argument will be on the ballot measure, because I've seen it so many times. It is that the common interest will be subordinate to parochial interests of different corners of the city. The budget process will break down. People will not make interest in the public. Now, and remember, you're going an uphill battle because people are used to at large, and they basically will say, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So the argument of what's broken is always the challenge in reform. But I think in the long run, you can win this if you can indicate how decisions will be made better with district elections, not just an argument that it would be better here or there, but that actually better policy will be made. And the truth is, it is better policy. But you'll be amazed how quickly the argument becomes that all good decisions are made citywide because that's how we've always done it. Now, I know that veils a lot of other subordinate arguments that aren't being expressed directly, but it's a winnable argument. But I think it takes some time, and it's really a civic coalition that moves the system, or a ballot measure, or a lawsuit. Now, I don't know what state law recourse you have compared to California to file a lawsuit, but they've been very successful out here. So it's a mixture of pressure, argument, persuasion, coalition, civic leadership, and then getting it on the ballot somehow, and then winning it by saying better policy will be made for the whole city.
Yeah, I think I would only add, I think the moment kind of thing that Gary was talking about at the beginning, we are in the early stages of this new organization of how the city of Columbus conducts its elections for city council. One of the things that we did see at the statewide level in Ohio is that, again, the changes to create this redistricting commission that they currently have had to fail before this could actually, now come, right? So in other words, this redistricting commission created 5 sets of unconstitutional maps. Right. So again, at any point in time, the fact that every single time the state Supreme Court came back and said unconstitutional, 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 right? Ohioans who don't really trust politicians to begin with, nor would I recommend that they should, are starting to see that maybe this solution that was proposed in 2018 and passed in 2018 was not sufficient, right? That we need to have a much different kind of change. And so without saying, kind of wait and just watch and see how it turns out, I think, again, you may be able to collect certain amount of evidence. But again, I think you would look at the evidence objectively and see, is it working? Is it not working? Is it working for fair representation, equitable representation? Is it working on the better policy kind of thing? I mean, you'd want to really do the analysis to figure out, is this failing, right? And if it is failing, then what's the next solution, right? What's the next step? Because I don't know if you all would agree with me on this, Gary, right? But, my sense is certainly what happened in California was you got to the redistricting commission and then you got to top 2 primary. And then, so there were a host of things that kind of started to happen at the statewide level in a kind of cascading sense that allowed for, I think, more equitable representation and more equitable elections. And so I don't know if you all would say that that's an outlier because California is an outlier on many things, or if you would say that that might be typical of how some of these electoral reforms could take place.
It's a mixed bag, I have to be honest. The independent redistricting commissions in California for both state legislature and Congress were created at the impetus of the Republican Party, who thought that they were getting a raw deal. And it turns out if you do a nonpartisan redistricting commission, the Democrats actually increased their share of both bodies and the state's congressional delegation because the Democrats were actually undercutting their own electoral strength by protecting incumbents. And when you started drawing fair lines, Democrats did even better. So the Republicans asked for a reform and they got an unintended result, which happens a lot. The top 2 history is a little bit different. Raphe may have a better memory of how that came about.
Yeah, I'm not a big fan of the top two in California, to tell you the truth. I miss the old party primaries. And now the candidates have figured out how to create party primaries, sometimes in the other party. Can I go back to something though, separate from your questioner, which is to
Sure.
flip what Gary said on its head about the inadequacy of the district residents and at-large voting? Rather than waiting until you see how that plays out, is treat that as a step toward a real district system. In other words, paradoxically, look at the logic of why they adopted that and begin to look at who's calling that council member for services. You know, are they getting calls from the place where they are residents, or is everybody getting the calls, et cetera? And in effect say, well, you know, not the greatest idea in the world, I'm not crazy about it, but it certainly shows a recognition of the importance of districts, and then build on that so that you're not making an enemy out of the people who supported that, but simply complimenting them for getting you where I think the city really needs to end up. Otherwise, I think you could have a 10-year wait to see how this new model works out before getting started. I'd grab it now to see what evidence it provides for a different approach.
Any other questions? We have any questions online, Glennon? No?
We do not.
All right. Well, with that, then we want to thank Gary and Raphe for joining us. So could we? Over to Jordan, and she's going to close us out.
All right, well, I want to also thank Doctors Hancock, Segura, and Sonenshein for that amazing presentation. I feel like I learned so much. I pulled this quote from the conversation: independence does not mean creating an alternate power structure, it means creating an alternate role. And so for all of us, including us here at Kerwin, who are kind of thinking about how do we work alongside stakeholders at the government level, at the community level, these are all things of how do we input ourselves as researchers, or how do we think of our role as researchers in creating a more equitable future. So thank you again for joining us. Our next forum event is going to be on April 18th. We have Dr. Nicole Yaron, who's an associate professor of political scientist here at Ohio State, along with Dr. Lauren Valentino, who's an assistant professor of sociology at UNC. They're in North Carolina, and they're going to be, oh, they're at Chapel Hill? Okay, yeah, I was like, UNC, which one? So they're going to be sharing their work with us in a talk entitled Americans' Misperceptions, and misses in parentheses, of the race and gender wealth gap. So that's going to be on April 18th. We look forward to you guys joining us. As always, if you want to learn more about the work we're doing here at Kerwin or our forum series, please check out our website. Alternatively, you can also email us to be added to our listserv, and we hope to see you next time. Thank you.